sake, I do have some for you. Yeah, so Rowan Atkinson said that we have modern day equivalent to medieval mobs roaming the streets recently, and that got me thinking. Yeah, like literally, Mr. Bean got me thinking. 2021, right? Shout out. But we've been talking a lot about like history and stuff recently, and I thought kind of like the best way to understand and figure out like cancel culture would be to look at the history of it, right, and see if there's anything interesting there. Spoiler alert, there's definitely some interesting stuff. So in today's episode, we're going to take a look at like the idea of where the mob comes from, its roots in the 18th and 19th century. We're going to take a look at the French Revolution, as I've said millions of times, but it is important in understanding like the climate at the time. I don't know much about it myself, so I just thought we could have a little look. In a little bit of detail, but we'll gloss over quite a lot. But first and foremost, we'll probably start with where Rowan Atkinson kind of makes us start with medieval mobs. At the end, we're also going to go into crowd psychology a little bit, go into a prominent crowd psychologist, and yeah, Q&A at the end. So that's kind of what's going to go on. 20 minutes, visuals won't be that good, I'm really sorry. But I use Rowan Atkinson's statement to begin with because the word medieval is a good place to start from. In history, wherever people have lived in large groups, like villages, cities or towns, there has been like mobs in like one form or another. A video called Crowds, Masses and Riots on YouTube, which I'll post, I'll say afterwards, highlights the importance of crowds, or the mob, and shows how integral they were to the political process back in the Roman Republic. So in ancient Rome, before the internet of course, senators of the Roman Republic would propose new policies, and they met with crowds of either dissatisfied or satisfied people. People would often get violent, and yeah, we are much more reserved these days, but back in Rome you could literally be beaten to death by a crowd of people. Trigger warning, by the way. And nobody would be stopping it, and in many cases the mobs never got violent, but the implicit threat of violence is kind of what gives the mob its power. The point is, it really wasn't seen as something that was awful and terrible. It was actually an accepted part of the political process. Of course, those in power would have preferred it to have not been the case, but they didn't have a choice. That was kind of the point, right? The point I'm basically making is that the crowd that was against a specifically tyrannical new legislation would try to succeed in stopping it, and that's kind of a good thing. So this kind of thing persisted throughout history, gloss over, but it wasn't seen as a terrible, horrible act of public disorder. Quite the opposite. The birth of the modern mob, as we see it today, was the French Revolution, so we're going to have to take a little look at that, but we will gloss over quite a bit. And sorry about that. As defined by the lovely Wikipedia, sorry, downvote me, but the French Revolution refers to the period that began with the Estates Generales of 1789, basically a general assembly representing the French estates of the realm. This was the government structure at the time, the hierarchy if you like. And this hierarchy basically went like this. The first estate was the clergy, and they was the most important, the clergy being like the religious figures, priests and stuff. The second estate was the nobility. The second estate was the nobility, so that's like kings and queens, lords, barons, so they had like the second estate. And then the third estate, that was the commoners, basically me and yourself, and yeah, that's kind of how the government worked, the Estates General. I might just call it the government, French government, to make it a little easier, but anyway, and it basically ended on November 1799 with the formulation of the French consulate. So it was only a 10-year period, but it was a very important 10-year period. During this period, Napoleon Bonaparte, as first consul, established himself as head of a more authoritarian government, Authoritarian basically means a strong central power to preserve a political status quo. He made reductions in the rule of law, separation of powers, and democratic voting. He never came outright and said it, but he was basically like the supreme leader. But the consulate is one of the most important periods in all of French history, and it's now referred to as like a time period. But widespread local distress led to the Convocation, which was basically a special gathering of the Estates General or the French government in May 1989. And this was the first time for over 100 years. In June, the estates were converted into a National Assembly, which was basically a revolutionary assembly formed by the representatives of the Third Estate, so the commoners, the people in simple terms. And at that point, they passed a series of really radical measures. Among them was the abolition of feudalism, which is basically just old-time rules, taxes and privileges that are left over from the age of feudalism. It's a whole of a rabbit hole on its own, but one of the central events of the French Revolution was to abolish feudalism. They also managed to lessen state control of the Catholic Church and extend the right to vote, all in a month. So, pretty cool. But the next 3 years was dominated sadly by struggles for political control exacerbated by economic depression and social unrest. Now, external powers like Austria, Britain and Prussia viewed the revolution as a threat, leading to the outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars in April 1792. So, sorry about all the dates. I did tell you to bring a notepad. Then the establishment of the First French Republic. This was basically a people's government. Happened on the 22nd of September 1792. Gosh, they're making me go dizzy now. Followed by the King's execution in January 1793. So another quite an important part of the French Revolution was an uprising in Paris that replaced the Girondins, who was a political party who dominated the National Assembly, with the Committee of Public Safety, which was headed by a guy called Maximilien Robespierre. You've probably heard the name. That's exactly why. Oh well, it's basically because it sparked a thing that's called the Reign of Terror, which was actually a pretty flipping savage time to not want kings and queens telling you what to do. It was an attempt to eradicate alleged counter-revolutionaries in the period of the French Revolution, when, following the creation of the First French Republic, a series of massacres and numerous public executions took place in response to revolutionary fervour, anti-clerical sentiment and accusations of treason by the Committee of Public Safety, and it were all, as you can imagine, causing massive problems internally. There is disagreement among historians over when exactly the Reign of Terror began. Some consider it to have begun in 1793, but others cite it as being in like 1792, or even as far back as like July 1789. So I thought I'd throw that in there just in case we do have any historians in the crowd that are gonna tell me off for anything. But by the time it ended, by the time that had ended in July 1794, so only a few years after, over 16,000 had been executed in Paris and the provinces. The Republic faced a series of internal royalist and Jacobin revolts. The Jacobin was one of the most, if not the most, influential proper political party, or club as it was referred to during the French Revolution of 1789. But in order to deal with these, the French Directorate, which was like another form of government, took power in November 1795. But despite military success, the war led to economic stagnation and internal divisions, and in November 1799 the Directorate was finally replaced by the Consulate. And the French Directorate is often referred to as the last 4 years of the revolution. But yeah, that's kind of the revolution in a nutshell. We glossed over loads and loads and loads and loads and loads. And I'm really sorry about that. But the point of the whole thing is like, basically over the next 2 centuries, the key principles of the French Revolution, like equality, would inspire campaigns for the abolition of slavery and the universal suffrage. The storming of the Bastille is still widely used is a widely used image to exemplify like revolution basically. Let me try. Where is it? That one there. You've probably seen it. Like, it's still used to this day, and its values and institutions still dominate French politics, and many historians regard the French Revolution as one of the most important events in recent history, which it probably was. Like I say, it still stands today as a testament and influence to what can be achieved when people physically gather together, united against a common cause. So I think that's important moving forward. As we do, however, several writers and scholars over the year had tried to explain and understand what the hell were going on, creating a field of research called crowd psychology. Also known as mob psychology, but we're going to call it crowd psychology, and then refer to the mob as crowds, I think, from now on. But it's a branch of social psychology, and social basically just means interactions, people interactions. Pardon me. Social psychologists have developed several theories for explaining ways in which the psychology of crowds differs from and interacts with that of the individuals within. Major theories in crowd psychology include Gustave Le Bon, Gabriel Tarde, Sigmund Freaky Freud, and Steve Reacher, just to name a few. We're going to talk about Gustave Le Bon, though, in this particular episode, because he pretty much did define it. So, yeah, this particular field relates to the behaviours and thought processes of both the individual crowd members as and the crowd as an entirety. Crowd behaviour is heavily influenced by the loss of responsibility and the loss of responsibility of the individual and the impression of universality of behaviour, both of which increase with crowd size. So that's kind of like the basic key principles. I kind of butchered that a little bit. One sec. Quick cigarette. But it's at this point when when crowd psychology started to come around, the whole idea of the crowd started to change. It stopped being looking at like a rational gathering of people united under a common cause, but rather barbaric nomads fueled by a thirst for blood. But that same like noble savage in a room alone would be fine. He'd be kind and courteous and probably not want anything but a nice hug. So that dude I mentioned a minute ago, Gustave Le Bon, was a French doctor of medicine and witnessed parts of the revolutionary waves firsthand, the French Revolutionary waves firsthand, but not from the eyes of the working man, from like the elite sort of perspective. He was like, his dad basically worked in government and stuff, and he was like the direct descendant of some other flipping really important French dude. But the point is, he was born into like a wealthy family and he was already into government, so he was opposed to the revolutions that he would later go on to see, which then influenced his best known work and something that influences crowd psychology still today, which is called The Crowd, a Study of the Popular Mind, which honestly I read through and it is kind of insane, some of the shit that goes on in there. In fact, he says, quote, "By the mere fact he forms part of an organised crowd, a man descends several rungs on the ladder of civilization. Isolated, he might be a cultivated individual, but in a crowd, he is a barbarian." End quote. So that's a genuine quote. So Le Bon and other crowd psychologists like him that basically thought the crowd was dangerous, irrational, most of all had an insatiable appetite for blood, war and disorder. By default, basically, people are barbaric when they're in numbers. But they sadly, however, negate the fact that people usually have something to rally about and something to actually be mad about. So yeah, crowd psychology fails to consider the socio-economic and or political problems that clearly play a massive role in getting people passionate enough to get up and go outside. Not to mention all the other times that people gather in crowds and it's absolutely fine and nothing bad happens. But yeah, let's not talk about that, shall we? The crowd was made out to be indefinitely violent and unreasonable, and I'm not saying some crowds are problematic, because of course they are, but in Le Bon's book and in others like it, every crowd was violent. In the intro to his book, actually, he writes that, quote, "Little adapted to reasoning, on the contrary, crowds are quick to act." So yeah, basically in short, crowds couldn't be reasoned with and were irrational. Therefore, the problems that they represented were also just that, irrational and unreasonable. A lot of what we know about crowds comes from the 19th century, and still today people like Le Bon are cited. Interestingly enough, even for digital crowds. So Le Bon's work is actually foundational in how we think of digital mobs. Because although others did work in this field too, it was Le Bon that kind of started it, and it's literally hard to overstate how influential that dude's work has actually been. The book by John Ronson, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, from 2015, borrows a lot from Le Bonian crowd psychology, as it's now called, and sparked actually a lot of debate due to its direct critique of it. But in a nutshell, he points out glaring holes in Le Bonian psychology and kind of uses Twitter as an example, which a lot of you probably are thinking, Twitter? Wow, isn't that like a really scary, crazy place where everyone gets cancelled? Which, yeah, totally it is, but actually from like really looking at it, this dude found that the cancellations were from really diverse set of people. Like, it was women, men from all over, and there were nasty stuff there, but there was also like some really constructive critiques, like pleas of cries. So yeah, but the fact is, it was always diverse and from women and men all over the world. So the opposite to what is expressed by crowd psychology. Another really good and well-cited English study the well-cited study by English historian E.P. Thompson, who took a detailed survey of the food riots, and that's called Moral Economy for short. So basically the food riots were a regular occurrence back in like the 18th century England, and they're often remembered as being irrational and violent, but when he actually took a closer look, he found that, quote, "a highly complex form of direct popular action, disciplined and with clear objectives." So most of the outbreaks was basically due to fluctuations in the price of grains that made up 80% of the caloric intake at the time. So most of the people that were there were only mad because the prices that they told was fair wasn't what they was actually paying, if that makes sense. And that's why they was out rioting. Like, it wasn't like some irrational sort of, just people going crazy, and there was a total reason behind it. Like, grain prices were too high, people couldn't afford it, and it were causing crazy frenzies. So the thing with like Le Bon's kind of work is it's clearly useful politically, and it gives a great reason that is backed by science and real scientists, proving that crowds are irrational, so obviously they shouldn't be listened to, right? If they're irrational, then why listen to them? I mean, and we kind of are seeing a lot of that today in today's society with cancel culture, and dismissing the crowds as irrational, and consequently their causes or reasons as well. By always reducing it to cancel culture, to just the culture part, we're kind of like not really thinking about like the person or the reason as to why like the cancellation is happening in the first place. Very much like in the 18th and 19th century, where the actual issues behind the riots and stuff went widely unspoken about. So, quick break. So, after getting a little bit of a better understanding of the crowd and where the idea kind of comes from, we can start to draw little bits of like parallels to today's society, I suppose. I think that history is definitely important, not to be cliche, which now saying that is cliche, but as our friend George Santayana says, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So, in summary, the all or nothing approach to cancel culture or mobs in general relies on the stripping away of nuanced details and individualism. I absolutely agree that in some cases mobs, digital and physical, have got it wrong, but proclaiming all movements are inherently violent and unreasonable under scrutiny actually falls apart. Situations are way more complicated under a microscope, usually, and have some reason or cause behind it. It isn't just people being irrational. And I think that's kind of important to remember. It's important to remember the reasons behind said cancellations, and like the context, because like context is obviously important. So yeah, I'm gonna leave that there, and I'll let you think about it for yourself. I won't tell you what to think. And today I just basically wanted to explain a little bit about the idea of the crowd or mob, where it comes from, and shine a little bit of light on that. Just like most of the episodes, it's just a jumping point to start from, if anything at all. And I will share all the links at the end if you want to go down your own rabbit hole and like really read all of the literature, because there's a lot to go through. Like, I have low-key been kind of doing this for a bit because there's so much to read through. So yeah, that's kind of the presentation part of the stream, if you like. Thank you very much for everybody joining us and sitting through that. I really appreciate you guys and gals. Let me get you a thank you up. So, seriously, some of my tabs would be crazy. I'm reading some next 19th century literature recently. So, thank you for watching, everybody. I really appreciate you guys and gals. I hope that was okay. We seem to have a fair few more people now, 37 of yous. Welcome. I'm sorry that you came a little bit late. We was going for a